Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is Dive In, How Marine Mammals Breathe. And it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab Expedition Leader, Kristina Disney. Kristina, thanks again for being here today. And once again, thank you for bringing us such a unusual and interesting topic. I'm dying to hear what you have to say on this. Let's dive in.
All right, thank you, Sunny, and thank you everyone for joining today. This is a pretty fun one for many reasons, I think, but partially because I think in my mind, I've moved to the coast here. Now I live on Vancouver Island, and I've started to try to spend more time in the water. And so, that flat surface, that horizon line, when you look out at it, it seems like there's a whole other world that exists down there that we're so separate from, right? And we feel so separated from it by the simple fact that we can't breathe down there, right? That very simple, very basic function that we need every second, every moment, it makes it seem like it's a place that's inaccessible to us. And so part of the inspiration for this was sort of rekindling some of those very actual basic relationships that we still share with lots of marine mammals, down to our physiology, our anatomy, who and what sort of makes us who we are, right? And even though we don't realize it. And so, yeah, it's kind of giving a shout out to some of our marine mammal cousins, and also as a beautiful different way to see the world, right? So hopefully by the end of this, we'll kind of see the world maybe, or start to perceive the world a little bit the way that marine mammals do. And that whale that was holding the image there, or was holding our placeholder image coming in, is actually the animal that we have on record, at least that humans have recorded, for the deepest diving marine mammal. And it's the Cuvier beaked whale. And the longest recorded dive, and it holds the world record for any marine mammal, is 222 minutes, which is absolutely wild when I think about it, because that time, right, that's almost just shy of 4 hours, about 3 hours and 40 minutes, right? And I think, a little bit of training, I got my, I can hold my breath for a few minutes, but that's about it, right? And even that seems like an awful long time when you're counting the moments and waiting time. So, right, their whole bodies have changed so that they can hold these really deep breaths, so that they can dive these really amazing distances, right, to this whole other world. And those body changes that we're talking about, right, it's everything from their skin to their build, right? They're really streamlined. They can store oxygen differently than terrestrial mammals can. And so it's all to get down to these really deep depths, right? And I think this is kind of the Titanic is always a nice, good touch point, right? To thinking about how deep we're talking here, right? So these whales that are hunting at these extreme depths are going down to about 2,000 meters. So that's things like sperm whales, beaked whales, right? These are our really deep divers. If you're going to go into seals or pinnipeds, right, you could say that the elephant seal is kind of in there too. It could go around 1,500 meters. And there's still so much of the ocean beneath that, right? But they're making these really crazy dives, and their bodies are not just being able to deal with not having access to oxygen on a, at an at-call basis. They also have to deal with pressure. And this is one thing I love for many reasons. So this is showing you the bottom, shows you how deep the cup went. So the cup went down to 3,500 meters, and then it showed you how much it's shrunk, right? And so I have a little visual picture there. But so right, it's kind of like that's how much pressure is on it. It's kind of a way to visualize it a bit. But also I just love that at the end of the day, you can give scientists very amazing budgets and all of the fancy equipment, but sometimes to get a point across, you just have to go back to something really simple. So it's a nice nod to the communication effectiveness of science. But if we take that pressure and we go back to the fact that it's not just the pressure on our bodies, but that pressure also comes into play with how we breathe. And so, here at the surface, if you're at sea level, you're at about 1 bar or 1 atmosphere of pressure, right? And this balloon is giving you an idea of what that pressure is doing to your lungs, right? Because marine mammals are just like us. They have to come to the surface to breathe. They have lungs. They don't have gills. And so that pressure is going to force I always forget how to say this, alveoli. I'm probably saying it wrong. The little pockets of air in our lungs, and that's forcing that smaller and smaller, right? So at the surface, if that balloon is our lungs, right, it is going to be a quarter of the size by the time it gets to 30 meters. Forget about 300 meters or 3,000 meters, just 30 meters. You've already shrunk our lungs to a quarter of the size of what they are at the surface. That's a lot of pressure, and that's really traveling not that far. And so, you know, I think if you're not a diver or someone who spends time underwater, maybe you spend some time up in the air, right? And so to make those equivalent pressure changes that you're experiencing in just 1 meter of water takes 1,000 meters of air to make that same, right? And it's because both air and water, they're a fluid, and they're always having pressure around us, even though we're, you know, when we're at the surface, we're used to this level and we don't notice it. But when you climb up a mountain, you know, you notice it's harder to breathe because there's less air there, it's less dense. And when it's less dense, there's less of it pushing on you. But water, that higher density, pushes on you so much more at such a quicker scale, right? So it's something that's kind of miraculous actually to think about, that it takes, you know, 4,000 meters to equal that 4-meter depth change if in air versus water. So it's pretty fantastic that when you think about all these marine mammals, their bodies have adapted to survive in these insane pressure zones, all while holding their breath, right? All of these dives that they do, they're doing it on a single breath, which is kind of amazing, right? If you had to hold your breath right now, how many tasks do you think you could accomplish before you had to open it again, right? Forget about going and hunting for, you know, your meal for that day or multiple times that day. And most of us, that task time that we would have, you know, we could probably do a minute or two, right? Without any training, without sort of a breathe up. If we just all had to pause right now and go, like our fish friend, we might make it a minute or two. And so the reason why is because a bunch of alarms start firing in our body saying, uh-oh, uh-oh, uh-oh. And I've never thought about this way until I was looking it up for this webinar, and it's just a different way to think about our body, which I kind of like. It'll probably appeal to some people more than others, but it's the idea that every one of your cells is a battery. And so what happens when we hold our breath is that as soon as that happens, we actually start changing the ratio of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our body and in our blood and our cells everywhere. But that carbon dioxide, it actually changes the amount of free ions. So the number of hydrogens that are cruising around there looking for an electron is kind of what's going on. And it changes that ratio, just like how a battery works. And so if you think about a battery, right? And this is maybe why it's easier to visualize. If you think about a battery getting overcharged or undercharged, then you can see that it would have some effects, right? So, you know, if anyone has the unfortunate part of opening up the rope and the battery's all exploded, it's kind of a scary moment or a scary notion. Let's see if this will switch here. There we go. So in our body, what that equates to is our organs are really what's most sensitive to they're like, you know, that's different parts of our cells and our batteries. They're the sensitive parts of the batteries that if those cells get out of function, bad things in our body can start to happen, right? So in our heart, a lack of oxygen means that we start getting arrhythmia. It means we start losing that consistent beat that's keeping that blood, that fluid that's keeping our whole systems functioning happy and healthy. We start losing that beat, you know, you get a bad dance partner, it's not a good time. That's what's keeping our whole body in check. Our brain, right, our heart and our brain, those are arguably our two most important organs. And our brain is very, very sensitive to changes in oxygen and changes in carbon dioxide. So what our brain has is it's constantly monitoring pH. pH is a measure of those kind of free ions. And when we keep too much carbon dioxide in our body, it builds up that acid, and that's what sends our pH out of balance. And when that happens, our body starts telling all of our systems, you need to take a breath, you need to correct this, right? And so it does that, and it tells us that you need to breathe in order to get that out. And so, you know, when we look at this for the average human, right? you go 1 to 2 minutes without any air, that's actually when brain damage can start occurring. If you go up to 5 minutes, that's when you're gonna get death of brain cells. 10 minutes and death is likely, right? And there's a little box underneath there that's in dark green that's not super highlighted, but it says overall health and specialized training may impact the timeline, right? So I think the world record for a breath hold is something insane, like, I should actually remember this, but it's something like, it's more than 12 minutes, I think, right? And then there's also some like assisted things with if they use, whether they can use oxygen or not, if they can like take an oxygen tank and breathe up with that, I think they can do, there's someone who holds like a 20-minute record, which is wild, but that's with a lot of specialized training and right, you're building up your body's tolerance and capacity. So that's a different category. And so, but it's showing you that, you know, that note of specialized training, right? Well, what we expose our bodies to and what we make their normal, right? We're mammals. Mammals are extremely adaptive, and we can live in all of these, live and actually thrive in a lot of really crazy environments, right? So when we think about the Tibetan Plateau, which is on average at around a 4,000 meter elevations, remember when I was kind of giving that comparison, right? So we're at the other far end of the scale, very, very little oxygen, where, you know, there's a few million people living there, and they are able to survive there, right? Their bodies have adapted to being there. And that's through, I mean, part of it was through conscious breathing exercise of it. Part of it is just their genes, right? They've activated different things so that they have like a larger body mass index, so that, right, the larger the body size, the more oxygen holding capacity you have, things like that. And then, you know, we can do the reverse direction. Humans living, you know, surviving really, really high up, and then humans diving really, really deep into the ocean. So I think the world record right now here is that 202-meter picture that you can see, which is absolutely wild. At that depth, your lungs are actually completely collapsed. And there's a whole bunch of stuff you have to be very, very careful of coming back up. But it, right, again, it's people pushing the bounds of what they thought was possible for a human body. And so it's just super impressive. I think that in of itself, right? But we can actually start to look inside of our bodies to understand how it is that these sort of extreme miraculous events can happen, right? And the first thing that we need to consider, and this is also the other thing to consider, so I'm going to walk through this kind of for humans, but this is true for all mammals. That's what's sort of amazing about this. So the first is, where are we going to find oxygen in our body, right? We're going to find it in our lungs, right? Just as big air sacs, basically, right? They're big balloons holding onto some air for us when we need it. But that's not the only place that we're going to have oxygen in our body. We can also find it attached to our hemoglobin, and we can find it attached to our myoglobin. So what are those things? Those are the proteins that are in our blood and in our muscle that hold on to oxygen, right? So once that blood flows by our lungs and it does the exchange, these are the actual molecules that say, oh, I'll take that oxygen, thank you very much, and I will take it to wherever it needs to go in the body. So myoglobins, the big thing to know about the difference between these two is that myoglobins we only find in muscle, and hemoglobins we find all throughout the body because they're traveling in the blood, right? And their ability to hold oxygen is different. So you can kind of see that myoglobins, right, at low oxygen levels, they can still have a large amount of it, but hemoglobins, they need to have a higher pressure of oxygen built up, or partial pressure of oxygen built up, so that they can hold more. But that's just sort of, or I guess that'll come into a bit of play later when we look at where and how we find those proteins existing. And this is just a quick aside, not to do with breathing, but I always just think this is so cool, as a quick nod to how amazing Mother Nature is that if you look at a hemoglobin molecular structure, and you look at a chlorophyll plant structure, they are the exact same carbon chains set up. The only difference is that if you look in the center of each of these, one has an iron molecule and one has a magnesium molecule, right? So these are the two life sustainers of, you know, plants and warm-blooded animals, right? And so, you know, if you go down to a really base level, we're not that different. And I find that very humbling and also very, very reassuring. I always feel better when I realize that I'm just like a plant chlorophyll. Okay, but back to diving, away from plants. We're not talking about plants today. Talk about plants another day. So The other thing, so that's where we're going to find the oxygen. Now we have to think about how we actually get that oxygen, right? We're breathing in and out. But breathing is one of those cool body functions that is both automatic. It's going to happen regardless of whether we want it to. If anyone has ever had that doctor or your friend tap you on the knee thing and your leg comes shooting up, you're not controlling it, right? It's just a reflex. So breathing is like that. It's automatic. You and I don't have to think about it. We can carry on with other tasks, and we're going to keep breathing in and out. But it is also autonomic, which means that we do have control over it, right? I can stop and hold my breath. I can choose to talk longer, then inhale, then pause. I can hold my breath. I can stop, right? That ability to change that actually then affects how our breathing pattern goes. If you ever stop and think about it, the moment you become conscious of your breath, you actually tend to breathe faster and shallower, because when you're not conscious of it, you get these really nice, calm, deep inhales and exhales, and it keeps you very calm. Whereas once you become conscious of it, we actually tend to veer towards hyperventilation. And so learning to be conscious of it, but keeping it at a good, healthy pace is a really great life skill that goes a long ways. And it's it's something I honestly think some of this breathing work we'll talk about in a little bit, I think needs to get, becoming a part of what you learn in kindergarten and all the way through school, because it makes a big difference. So the other part to think about, so we know that we can control it or we cannot control it. So then let's actually look at the lungs themselves, right? So when we're doing our automatic breaths and we're not thinking about it and we're just going on with our daily lives, we're exchanging about 20% of the air that's in our lungs, which is actually not very much, right? And that's called our tidal volume. So if I'm just casually breathing in and breathing out, I'm not reaching into the bottom of my lungs and switching that out, right? It's all mixing in there. It's not like it gets stuck at the bottom, right? It's always cycling, but really most of the oxygen is staying in my lungs. And so this is kind of showing you different reserve levels. And one thing I always want to point out too with this, so like there's tidal volume, and then if you look at the dark blue, there's something called residual volume. So that's if you breathe out as much and as long as you can. If I feel like I've pushed all of the air out of my lungs, there's actually still some in there. It's kind of like the gas tank in your car, right? Once it's installed, you can hit empty, but there's still some that kind of get stuck in little divots and just the shape of it, right? Those volume, those voids. So even when you completely fully exhale at the surface, you still have a little bit of oxygen in you. So when I'm talking about mammals diving and they have a lung collapse, it means that all of that oxygen, all of that air has been pushed out. So we're not designed for that really, not terrestrial mammals anyways. And so it's a much bigger stress on our system. And so with this and sort of the progression into how it is that marine mammals are able to do this, one thing that's also really important to keep in mind is that when we're not conscious of our breath and when it's automatic, there's actually quite a long pause between our inhales and our exhales. And this is another thing, once you become conscious of your breathing, we tend not to pause. We tend to inhale, exhale really quickly. But when we are on sort of autopilot mode, our pauses in between our inhales and our exhales can often be longer than the duration that we're inhaling or exhaling. And that pause, right, that natural pause in our body is kind of the baseline of where we start shifting over into different control systems. So when we're on automatic, this is all happening and we're not thinking about it. When we are on autonomic, it means that we have now become aware. But even when once we become aware, right, there's these other systems that are at play that actually still control things, arguably subconsciously. These are in responses to something we see, feel, hear. We're in a response to something, we have either a sympathetic or a parasympathetic response. So sympathetic nervous response is something that happens to us when our fight or flight kicks in, right? This is like an adrenaline rush and our pupils dilate, right? Our airways are dilated so we can get more oxygen, our heart rate speeds up, right? If we are thinking of, back to being potentially a Neanderthal, right? This is the time to run. There's a predator. It's not the time to be digesting food. It's when we get a bunch of sugar release, so we have a bunch of energy, and we lose a lot of blood flow to our extremities because we just need to focus and go. Whereas parasympathetic, that nervous side of the system, is when we're relaxed and when we're calm and when things are safe. That's the rest and digest sort of. And so that's when our pupils will constrict, right? We don't need to take in as much of our sort of as much light, but ultimately as much, we can kind of calm down a bit. We're salivating, which is something that's going to come in later for our digestion. Our airways, we don't need to be taking as much oxygen, and our heart rate can slow down. We can shift over into some digestive processes, right? And so these two things are usually at odds with one another, but they're always happening. And what's important is that your body, when it goes into one, it can come back out of the other. Or if it goes into a sympathetic, right? If you have a fight or flight response, that you can get yourself back into that rest and digest stage, right? Because those are both really important. Both have a function in your body and both need to keep each other in check and in balance. And so it's how these two systems play out, which is the amazing part of where what's called our mammalian dive reflex kicks in. It's like an override system that says, we are going to take what we need from both of those and we're going to survive what comes next, which sounds kind of scary, but it's mostly, it's a reflex that they call it a dive reflex because they first started studying it in marine mammals like pinniped, seals, but all mammals have the ability to do this, whether we're terrestrial or whether marine. Marine are just better at it because they've been evolving their life cycle to really hone in these adaptations. And so it alters our normal state and it kind of borrows one thing from each of those sympathetic nerves to deal with the fact that we don't have any oxygen. And it's basically to conserve our organs. That's what this reflex kicks in to make sure that we survive our time without access to available oxygen. And people have known, I think people have utilized this really for thousands of years, but let's say we started studying it in a more Western science way around the 1930s. There's a guy named Lawrence Irving and Per Scholander, and they were looking at it in seals, but then there's been work done all the way up on mice and things like that. And so it's conserving the heart, it's conserving the brain, right? It's where does your body need oxygen and how do we best keep it there? And so the trigger for this response to kick in for you and I is actually in our facial nerves, right? So this is why you can do it out of water, but if you really want it to kick in really strong and really quickly, the easiest way is to put your head underwater. It's because we have different facial nerves in along our cheekbones, and those, when they get kind of that like cold water shock, especially cold water, the colder the water, the faster that reflex will kick in. They actually, if the water is above 21 degrees Celsius, then it takes way longer for your dive reflex to kick in. And the longer it takes to kick in, the less oxygen efficient you are. So the faster it kicks in, the more your body's going to start conserving oxygen and making sure that you're going to survive what's coming next. So there's kind of three phases. The first is you get cold water and you stop breathing, right? Which makes sense. We can't breathe underwater. We don't have that skill. But the second part is we slow down our heart and we also constrict blood flow to our extremities, right? Because even though we love our hands and we love our feet and they're all part of us, these are not what need to survive the next few minutes, right? All the blood needs to go to our key organs because that's what we need to survive as an organism. So if we break that down step by step, hold your breath. That's actually called apnea. I think we associate it with sleep apnea, like the idea that you stop breathing while you sleep, but apnea just means it's the cessation of breathing. You've stopped breathing, and so your body now has to come to terms with that. And so this is where, so whether you want to call that the initiation or the response, right? If you're underwater, you could say it's a response, but this is when you're at the surface, or if you're just holding your breath, right? Then that's a conscious choice that you're making. But that conscious choice is still sending those signals to your body to start the next steps of the process. Oh yeah, and this is what I wanted to point out. So when we hold our breath, and you hold your breath and you just feel that ache starting and you can feel your body start to want to breathe, and it's telling you that this is not like you need to take a breath. It's actually not doing that because you're running low on oxygen. It's doing that because you're building up too much carbon dioxide. So if you look at this graph here, what it's showing you is that the dashed lines are the make or break points, right? So the blue dashed line is when you have too much CO2 that your body can handle, and the red dashed line is when you don't have enough oxygen for your body to handle. So if you look at what happens when we dive, right? that CO2 rises and reaches its limit before our bodies actually run out of oxygen. And not that, and that's still equally not good for our system, right? It's causing a bunch of haywire things. Remember what I said about the heart and the brain, and you get arrhythmia and your brain starts to shut down a little bit. So you still don't want to get too much CO2, but that response kicks in before there's a window there where you're, right, where you haven't actually hit your too low of oxygen, because you're in real bad trouble when you hit that oxygen line. And so that's what divers, they start to train their body both to handle more oxygen, but also to fight that response, so that they can tell their bodies that we are okay. And they do have some conscious control of it, right? And it takes a while to build up. It's not an easy path. And another connection when we think about oxygen and CO2 and how that relationship, we sometimes get confused about what's important, also comes into when we talk about CPR and recovery breaths, right? So if you ever have to do CPR on anyone, 30 compressions to 2 breaths. There's some stuff that's changed about this with COVID, and breaths became optional, but it's kind of gone back to it. So please take a first aid course. It's always good information to have, but ultimately this is your basics until EMR or someone like that can get there to help. But those breaths, right? I remember being confused about this when I just first started taking different wilderness first aid courses, was that if I'm breathing out my oxygen, haven't I used it all up? So it's not really even helpful. But in reality, that air that we breathe in, we've got that 21% oxygen, very small percent of carbon dioxide, a few other gases, and it's mostly nitrogen. And so when we breathe out, the nitrogen stays the same. We've lost some of the oxygen, but when you exhale, most of the oxygen is actually still there, right? It only went from 21 down to 17%. But if you look at the carbon dioxide, there's now 4% more carbon dioxide. So that means that it's gone up by 100 since you breathed in and breathed out, right? So that's why your body's like, let that CO2 out, right? But it also means that when you're trying to recover someone's breath and kick the respiratory back in, you're still sending them oxygen. That 4% of CO2 that you're giving them isn't going to harm them by any means. But what's important is that you're sending them 17% of oxygen, right? And that's still a lot for their body to take up and to handle and to use. So still super useful. All right, so apnea, first step of mammalian dive response. Second step is bradycardia or bradycardia. So your heart slows down, right? And it makes sense. The slower you go, the less energy you need, the less oxygen you're going to consume. So this is the easiest response that your body can have to make your oxygen, to make whatever oxygen and CO2 you have, that relationship last longer. If we just slow down the system, then everything will smooth out. And so there's been different studies that they've done on free divers. One free diver's heart rate down to 100 meters depth was like 27 beats per minute, but there's been some that have been recorded as low as 5 beats per minute, which is crazy. That's usually like a hypothermic person who would be alive and come back out of it, right? So these are the very edges of what our bodies can tolerate and sort of be okay. And this is a cool one because you don't even have to, like this one, you don't need to even be diving to see it kick in. So one way that freedivers sort of can test or build up on this, and again, please don't do this at home. Always do breathing exercises supervised by someone else, especially if it's anywhere near water. There's been really unfortunate tragic events of people like professional freedivers who are training in their bathtubs and are found dead because even though it's only a little bit of water, right, you're pushing your system. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but always do these things with buddies or and take care of yourself. But the story I wanted to say was that so different trainers, you sit and you breathe and then you stop or you hold your breath and then you stand up and you walk. And even though you started to move, right, so you'd think that, oh, I'm walking now, my heart rate will go up. Because they were sitting and holding their breath, they've already kicked in this system and actually their heart rate goes down as they're walking, which is pretty cool, right? It's essentially defying all the things of what we think could and should happen in order to make it so we can survive without access to oxygen. The third part is vasoconstriction. So we think about all of the vessel or all the veins and arteries in our body, right? If those squeeze tighter, then they're going to squeeze all of that blood somewhere. So in our capillaries, in our fingertips, and our toes, and our legs, that all gets squeezed so that the blood can go to our core. And so this one, right, is actually pretty cool. So it fits in well, part of countercurrent circulation of tying those things together in these diving animals and lots of other animals too. But this is also what fits into shock, right? So this is showing how multiple functions in a system can serve different purposes in different scenarios, right? So in this case, but it's related to the same thing. So the dive response is, oh no, we don't have oxygen, send the blood to the heart. Shock response is, we don't have oxygen, the same thing happens, right? So, and this can be for various reasons. Sometimes it's because of a physical injury, it can be psychological, it can be from an infection even, that can cause you to go into shock, and it's lots of different reasons. It can be related to your heart. If your heart isn't pumping well enough, you're not getting enough blood, so then you get low oxygen. It can be blood pressure issues, right? So shock, I guess the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because we often say, it's like, oh, I'm shocked, right? The fact that we have this sort of colloquial term and medical term. I think that the importance of the medical term gets lost on people because it's this reaction that your body goes through that even though, you know, you might have dealt with the wound or you might have dealt with the psychological or the infection, this is one of the things that can actually still really kill you quite quickly. And it's one of those ones where there's a threshold, and if you go over the line, your body isn't going to be able to come back from it. So it's kind of like whatever happens, whatever the initiation is, you lose oxygen, then you go into what's called compensated shock. So compensated shock is when your body is like, oh snap, we are losing blood, but I can recover from this. So it constricts its vessels, it sends the blood to the core, it speeds up the heart so that the blood gets going, right? It does it, but it can come back from that. But then let's say if the bleeding doesn't stop, or if the adrenaline actually sends it at the wrong time, then you can actually go further into shock, which is when you get into the decompensated phase. And then eventually if you hit irreversible, that's the line that you really want to be careful for. And so the reason why I bring this up is because it's sort of funny, because in the movies, you always see the people with the blanket after the big emergency happens. It seems like a really small thing, but that amount of heat that you can conserve in your body, and what that tells your brain is that it's more okay, and it gets you closer to coming out of that shock sooner. So it's one of the smallest things you can do, that if you ever come across someone who is starting to look pale, cool, clammy, or getting into any of those symptoms, it's a really small thing that you can do that can actually go like leaps and bounds into helping that person a long way. So sorry, I couldn't resist the small tangent into the medical world, just because it overlaps, and I think it's cool, and I think it's really useful, because if one person out of the 100 that are listening right now ever uses this, then it will have been worth the minute of everyone's time. So anyways, I'll leave it at that. Back to dive response. Okay, so all of that blood, right? I said that we're going to we're going to constrict our blood vessels, and it's going to send blood to the core, and so then that's going to conserve all of our organ function. That's the most important part, right? And so that's what's called a blood shift. The vasoconstriction leads into a blood shift, and that blood shift goes to your core, and it does a few different things. One, it actually increases the volume of blood in the lungs, and then and remember how I said those lungs are going to squish by 4 meters, they're a quarter of the size. Well, water doesn't squish as easily as air, and so that's one of the things that helps keep the structure of your lungs intact, is the fact that your body sent more blood there. It's one of the safeguards. The other thing, which is to keep in mind, right, when we look at a marine mammal and the way it's built compared to terrestrial mammals, they are streamlined, both because it's more efficient, but also look at how little blood is being sent far away, right? They have their fins and their face, but basically most of the blood is already kind of going to be at their core, right? So it's being conserved naturally. So they're just built for that. You wouldn't imagine like a giraffe being able to have nearly as impressive a response to send all that blood there, right? Because you have all of these long limbs getting in the way, that you have to send all these blood from far away, which has a whole bunch of other issues. All right, a couple other responses, which those are the big three. There's two more that kick in that are also kind of cool, although but maybe smaller on the or less impactful on the grand scheme of things. And one of those is called the spleen effect. So our spleen, tucked in along here, actually sorry, this side, it's what fights germs in our body. It's what controls our white blood cells, the number of red blood cells, platelets, right? If we need to form blood clots, that's what that organ is doing. And so when we kick in the dive response, it actually tells our spleen, it's like, whoa, we are short on oxygen, and it kicks out a whole bunch of red blood cells so that we can actually hold more oxygen in our blood. So it sort of ups the ante and ups the game for us so that we can survive a bit longer. And so usually it takes 1 or 2 dives for this to kick in. So the first dive, you wouldn't get all those red blood cells, but by the second, third, maybe fourth, fifth dive, your body would start kicking that over. And there's some evidence that like people who are really hardcore divers, it lasts in their body for a few days, that extra number of blood cells, which is pretty amazing, right? That their bodies are adapting on that level. Now, another one that's maybe a bit funnier is that you get immersion diuresis, aka you feel like you need to pee. And that's because your body, when all of that blood gets sent to your organs, that extra fluid, well, it's 2 parts. One, it's the water pressure on your own body, right? So you're in the water, so that extra pressure on you makes you feel like you have to pee. But then also all of that extra fluid around your organs, there's a hormone that essentially, because you've got that increase in blood pressure, it doesn't get sent out, and so it doesn't suppress your need to pee, and so your body's like, I need to pee now. And so for all of you who have that ever internal dilemma whether or not to pee in your wetsuit, I hope that you take a little comfort from this, that it's not just you, it's biologically your body is being like, the fight is on. So whether you do or don't, no judgment, but I hope you take some comfort in that small note. So all of this is so that all of these amazing mammals can dive down and make their way deep into the ocean. And it's because they're foraging, right? And they're going to different depths based on their life cycle and their needs. And right, so if we're looking at these ones, most of these are beaked whales, right? The sperm whales, these really deep divers, they're the ones that are, going way, way down. And, that foraging, this is the view. It is pitch black down there. There's nothing to see. I always wonder whether they keep their eyes open or whether they close their eyes once they're down there, right? Because this is the world down there. And it seems like a whole lot of effort to get to somewhere where there's nothing there, right? But that's just a perception of me as a little surface dweller, because that's not true at all. There is a world down there, right? And it's actually quite productive and it's quite amazing. And so if you're a baleen whale, when you dive, right, if you're a filter feeder, you're usually staying where there's light, however deep that light penetrates, because that's where those organisms are, that phytoplankton that's starting the cycle, right? But if you are someone like a sperm whale, or if you're an elephant seal and you're going way deep down, or those other beaked whales, right? They're hunting for these animals that live at crazy, crazy depths, right? They're going down for different fish that are pelagic. They're going down for squid, right? And that's because there is a life cycle down there. There is a whole ecology. And even if you don't think about it as super productive, just think about all the waste that is at the surface of all the life happening up here, and all those nutrients, regardless of what else is happening, are always going down. So it kind of makes perfect sense that the rest of the ecosystem would be like, well, I'm going to adapt so I can go down with those nutrients. That's essentially what the whales have done. They're following all these other organisms that have gone down to utilize those nutrients. They're just really big and impressive, and so we tend to clue into them more and we value their life cycle more, but they're tied in to these other creatures that we're very disconnected from, right? So this is our link. These whales, these pinnipeds, right? The elephant seal, these are one of those organisms that link us deep into the bottom of the ocean, right? And if the bottom of the ocean isn't doing good, neither are whales, and vice versa. You can kind of loop it all back together. And so the time that they can spend down there is relative to the hunting that they need to do, right? So I threw that in because this one wasn't updated, right? But the new time record is 222 minutes because of the Cuvier beaked whale. Elephant seals have been reported to go down for 2 hours. Sperm whales like 1.5 hours. If you've noticed here yet, there's one here that's not a whale, which is a sloth. This I think is so funny. Sloths are actually better swimmers than they are walking. They can swim about 3 times as fast as they can walk, and because they already have such a slow heart rate, right? That mammalian dive reflex is all about slowing down your heart. Sloths can actually cruise underwater for, it's been recorded, up to 40 minutes, which I just think is hilarious. So go sloths, way to outcompete fin whales and beavers and definitely humans and even dolphins on average. I'm sure there's probably a dolphins that something, but in general, right? But that's so the time that they're going down, the time that their body is adapted to reflects the depth and the species that they're foraging, right? So dolphins, they're at a much shallower foraging level. Think about beavers, right? They need to go down, they need to build to collect things, but they're not going way, way down. And so they don't need that same breath hold. And for us, right, you know, our little 2 minutes, which we are learning, different people with really amazing talents are stretching that 2 minutes into several minutes. You know, why do we do it? Well, we, you know, it's kind of like the Little Mermaid too, where instead of wanting to go from the ocean to land, we really just want to go from the land back to the ocean because there's this amazing world down there. It makes sense that we want to be a part of it and understand it and sort of see that world from their side. So we do our very best to train our bodies to adapt to be there for it. But the reason why we can do that in the first place is because that's actually who and what we are, right? It's a mammalian dive reflex. And actually, we are the most in tune with it when we are babies, right? So infants between up to about 6 months naturally close their windpipe if they're dunked underwater, and they kick in their dive reflex right away, right? It's, you know, you could argue it's something that's tied into coming out of the womb. And after about 6 months, we start becoming more conscious of it. So you could say that it's our own fault that our conscious mind gets in the way, because then we don't do it naturally. And that's when you have to sort of encourage them more to swim. But little babies swimming super well is because that dive reflex is still there. It's still on call and ready for us. And so it's not just, you know, it's in us biologically, but it's also within us sort of historically and culturally. So understanding and using our breath to the benefit has existed in multiple cultures for thousands of years. Probably some of the more well-documented ones will be places like China, India, Tibet, right? So Qigong, which is kind of like energy cultivation. So that's sort of been around for about 3,000 years. And there's ballpark around 3,000 different breathing techniques that were developed during that time that many have still carry forward today. Right, we have India and tying in the yoga practices and the breathing and the control of that. You know, that's still kind of, I'd say maybe more obvious in our culture today, just because that's become more widespread. And then, you know, lots of breathing techniques developed in Tibet, both sort of spiritually, but also because of the high altitude that they're living at. And so today, you know, it's important to go back to where we came from sometimes, because we're talking about those two systems, right? It didn't seem very exciting at the time, maybe, but that sympathetic and that parasympathetic, right? That fight or flight, rest and digest, where our body's at and how we're feeling about that, is at the ultimate function of why that breathing and having these breathing methods and controls and patterns can be so amazing for us. Because in the same way that something can happen and our body can react to it, if we're aware enough, we can change the way our body is acting by moving that system in reverse, right? So we can deal with sort of the stresses of our life that way, because that sympathetic response, right, that fight or flight, it can get activated even though we're not Neanderthals and we're not being threatened by a predator or a jaguar that's going to jump out of the jungle and eat us wherever we may or may not be. Right, our day-to-day life, more often than not, it kicks in that fight or flight response. And when we should be using it is not always, you know, we don't always need to have that response. But if our body is always stimulated to always be on that, then it's a hard life to always be living on that side of our nervous system. And so we can use our breath and use breath work and breath control to actually bring ourselves down from that and bring us back into parasympathetic nervous system, which means that our bodies can have a rest and it can recover and it can repair and it can take care of itself. And also, actually, on the flip side, I wanted to point this out too, right? Breathing work is not just about calming. Breathing work can actually make you more alert. It can do the flip side, right? Different breathing, if it, hyperventilation has a lot of negative connotations, so you have to be very, and validly so, right? But if you do different controlled circular breathing, it can actually boost your alertness and boost your sort of body function. There's different really old school breathing techniques from different cultures where like they can change their breathing enough that they can stay warm in a snowstorm, right? Because they're accelerating their system to create more heat, right? So that's just one kind of cool example. But the point being that our lives, as chaotic as they can be, we have to go back to the thing that's kind of automatic. It's one of the things that can bring us back down, ground us, and there's so many different ways to do it, right? There's things like belly breathing and controlled breathing, circular breathing. There's the Wim Hof method, if anyone's heard of him. If not, go take a Google. He's an interesting character, right? And all of them are different, and all of them serve different purposes, and some will be good for some people and maybe not for others. But I promise that if you're human and you're breathing right now, it will benefit you in some form or another to take some conscious control and some thoughts to how we breathe. Because we don't want to always be in that fight or flight stage. And we might not even realize that we're in it, right? We might not even really realize that we've been in survival mode all week, all month, all year. And so breathing is one of those really simple things that if you can pay attention to, you can start to reset your own system and pull yourself out of a spiral you might not even have noticed you were in. So I think I got enough time for this. I'll keep it short. We'll just do 2 cycles of this. This is just one example. I very much invite you to go look up at some other ones, but we'll take 30 seconds before I keep going. I got a few more slides to cover, but I think this is worth it. So this is called box breathing. And the idea being that it's an even rotation all the way around. So you're gonna breathe in for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 4, breathe out for 4, and then continue that. So we'll do that 2 rounds. So I'll count it on my hands if you guys wanna do it with me. All right, so you ready? So we're gonna inhale. Exhale. Inhale. And exhale. And I don't know how you feel, but I already feel kind of nicer. So, okay, that was a good 30-second pause. Let's keep rolling. Oh yes, my parting advice for that one. Sometimes the most important thing in a whole day is the rest we take between 2 deep breaths. All right. So, even if we do master our breathing control and we get to the highest level of free divers or Tibetan breathing techniques, I will lay it to you straight, we will still never ever be as good as a seal. We just don't have, we're not going to make it to compared with marine mammals because they have had millions of years to evolve to be masters of this, right? So as good as we get, we'll probably still never be as good as them, which is fair. You know what? Everyone's got their own niche, but the reasons why, right? How has their bodies evolved to be different, to be this different, what's actually going on, right, on the inside, I guess is what I'm getting at. So one of it, if I go back to those proteins, right? Remember before I said that in our body, we have hemoglobin, which is in our blood, and we have myoglobin, which is in our muscles. Now, marine mammals have, depending on the species and a few other things, but somewhere about 9 or 10 times as much hemoglobin and myoglobin in their body as terrestrial mammals do, right? So they just have more little oxygen carriers, just across the board, they do. They also have way more blood than us, right? So if you look at our body, we're about 7-8% blood, whereas like, for example, a Weddell seal here is about 22% of volume of blood, right? Just kind of by weight. And so they just have more blood, right? If there's more blood, they've got more oxygen carriers, they're already going to be able to just have more blood in their body. And they also have a bunch of other really cool developments too, right? So we're talking about like collapsing lungs. So this is a Weddell seal. You can find them in Antarctica. And so what they do is that when they dive, right, somewhere around that, getting past that 100-meter mark, right, they have really flexible ribs is one thing. So they actually can have that compression on there. Their lungs actually collapse somewhere around 100 meters. So for us, that's really sketchy, right? Because then you have to worry about things like the bends coming back up when that nitrogen, and also our rib cages are not as flexible, so that losing that can be really, really dangerous. And then when they do their ascent, right, their lungs, they actually, so what we think happens is that they funnel that air out into their muscles and it's dissolved, and then as they come back up, it goes back to their lungs and goes back into a gas state, right? Which is pretty freaking cool, pretty freaking amazing. We can be like Moira here there as she's holding up her block of ice. She can't quite make it as deep, but at least she gets some of the cold chills. I think they did the deep dive or the polar swim on that one. But the other thing is their other parts of their anatomy, right? So remember when I said tidal volume, when you and I breathe in and out, we only exchange about 20% of our oxygen. If you are a whale, let's say, on the other hand, you're going to exchange about 90%, right? So they do a way better job of kicking all that old air out and bringing in a fresh batch, right? And that makes sense because they're only at the surface for a little while. So they want to be as efficient as possible with their breaths. And also body size, right? The bigger you are, so not just, you know, that you have more blood or more myoglobin or hemoglobin, but the bigger you are, just the more volume you can just carry with you, right? So it's like, you know, if you have a big backpack, you can carry more things with you. If you have a little backpack, you have to survive on your little backpack. So they decided to build their bodies up so they have a big oxygen backpack. It's kind of the simple version of it. And there's lots of other really cool small physiological things too, right? Like for us, if we go down and we dive, we have to wear a mask that covers our nose because our nose would otherwise keep getting flooded. But if you're this awesome little fur seal, excuse me, they close their nostrils and they can actually close their ears too, right? So that they're not getting that air, or they're not losing any air being funneled in there. And also it's important to remember that this is something that they build up over their life cycle, right? So this is an adorable little baby fur seal, right? And so behaviorally, they're not doing these crazy deep dives right from when they're born, right? There's sort of this diving capacity that's built up on size and age. So once they hit about 6 months, then they start going deeper and deeper. But they start off with shallow, and then they go a little more, a little more, and a little more, right? Even they have to build up the tolerance to it. And there's also, you know, some are better than some are worse at it than whoever. Just like human, just like different skills. These are our deepest diving pinnipeds. Is the southern elephant seal. There's a big male here on the left doing a funny show. So they live at sea for like 2 to 8 months in a go, and they spend 90% of their time underwater, right? They can go down there for a couple hours, and again, those like 1,500 meters deep, they're going deep down. And so one thing, and here's just another adaptation that's crazy to think about, but the brain, right? It's the most sensitive to oxygen. It's the one that, or, you know, oxygen carbon dioxide relationship. And so even they've evolved so that their brains actually cool down more as they dive. So the cooler they are, the less oxygen that they're going to need, right? Because it slows the whole process down, right? So even just that's another way that they try to, or their bodies are designed to not have any hypoxic injury. And then if we think about, if we switch over to like baleen whales, right? So they're not diving nearly as deep, and they're often doing shallower bouts, right? So they go down. If you're a gray whale, then you're going to be scrutiny along the side of the bottom and actually scratching up and picking up those sediments. But like they have lots of crazy adaptations. So their skin even, right? So they're actually kicking out oil from their skin, which is going to make them more smooth. But another oil, so when they're breathing and they're exchanging that nitrogen, so when you get the bends, it's when those nitrogen bubbles come out on you. So some of the froth that you see that comes out when a whale does the spouting, sorry, my brain went dead there for a second, those bubbles are actually nitrogen that's been trapped in an oil mixture that the whale creates, and it's one of the ways that they think that they help get rid of that nitrogen toxicity, or make sure that those nitrogen bubbles don't come out in a bad way. So that's just like another amazing, very cool adaptation in order to get around that. And I know I'm just about out of time, and I also realize they're not marine mammals, but they're penguins, and they're all diving in. So with that, I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the mammalian dive reflex, and yeah, hopefully we still have time for a few questions, and I'll pass it back to you, Sunny.
Thank you so much, Kristina. To quote one of our viewers, who knew a webinar on mammal breathing could be so much fun? So let's jump into some questions. First of all, what is the name of the cute little fish with its cheeks puffed out that you showed in the earlier part of the webinar?
Oh, I don't know. I'm sorry. I nicked that one off of Wikipedia. I fully concede to that one.
It's so cute. Okay, then let's see here. Um, so one of our viewers was having trouble with the box breathing
Mm.
and was just curious, is that something you can build up over time? Is it a function of tiny lungs or, what can you say about that? Is that something someone can work into?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and that's a really good point. So one, absolutely everybody's bodies are very different, and that's both to just like physiologically and also things we've experienced, right? People who have had smoke inhalation damage or COPD or things like that, right? Like your lung capacity might just be different, and that's okay. And you can find, either maybe different cycles or repetitions that are more comfortable and sort of start from there. And then the second part is yes, absolutely, you can build it up. A lot of it, as I'm learning, as I kind of go down through my own past and some of this, a lot of this is tension. The ability to relax and to not hold any stress or any tension in your rib cage, these are your intercostal muscles in between your ribs. So when we breathe, so the muscles that control our breathing come from three places. They come from our diaphragm. So if you breathe in as much as you can and you flex your belly out, that's your diaphragm. That's that tissue between sort of our lower organs and our lungs, and that when we breathe in, we push our diaphragm out, and when we breathe out, our diaphragm sucks in. So that controls most of our breathing. But a second part is our intercostals, which is in between our ribs, and actually our shoulder blades, so our clavicles. So if you were to make the biggest inhale that you possibly could right now, what I'd want you to do is you breathe in and push your belly out, and then keep breathing and kind of expand your chest, and then even keep breathing a little bit more and arch your back and pull your shoulders up. And if you do that, you've actually created as much space inside of your chest cavity for your lungs to expand. So one, you can just get more comfortable with holding your breath and with that sort of pauses, because it is a mind game too. A lot of it is just we don't ever think to control it. And so the first time you try to, your body's like, no, we don't do this. But it's like getting used to a new flavor of food. If you give it a bit of time, maybe you'll never like it, but at least you'll get comfortable with it. That's how I feel about cilantro. But yeah, so some of it you can change. Some of it is stuff that you are just sort of born with, or maybe something experience, etc. So I think with a little bit of practice, maybe box breathing would be good, or maybe you'll find another one. But yeah, it's cool to once you go down the rabbit hole, it's a good one, and there's no downsides to learning to breathe different ways, I think.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us the name of the whale that you talked about earlier in your webinar?
Yeah, so
Like
if it
right
was
at the
from
beginning.
right at the beginning, yeah. So it's Cuvier, so it's Cuvier, and it's a beaked whale. So they're really torpedo shaped. Their fins actually kind of like fit into their body more so than other whales, because they really do just kind of like get down there and then they glide, which is pretty sweet. And that's kind of like the family or the group of whales. Sperm whales are also really deep divers, but the beaked whales just in general are those really deep divers.
Fascinating. Well, thank you again. That's the last question we have time for today. So I'll turn it back to you for closing comments.
Thank you everyone for going down the rabbit hole with me. I had a great time getting this ready for you, and I had a lot of fun sharing everything. So I hope you had a few good take homes. And if you are tuning in, my next webinar is going to be June 8th, and it's going to be a little different, everyone, from before, because I'm actually going to present my own PhD research. So I would love to be quizzed on it. So if you remember that, put it in your calendar, and I would love to hear some questions, because I got a big test coming up. So let's see what you guys can get me ready for. But either way, thank you all very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
We'll look forward to that. That sounds fascinating, and we're up for the challenge. We're going to stump you. Thanks again, everybody who tuned in. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.